Hey, happy 2025. What do you say we have a beverage of your choice? For me, it's going to be a glass of wine because it is the evening, despite the fact that I really hope to get this done earlier today, and chat my personal favorite books of 2024 because it is one of my favorite things to do and to watch from others. And I always hold it to the last minute because I like to leave the option open for something at the very end of the year to sneak into my favorites, for which I was in fact vindicated this year, though it could have been self-fulfilling prophecy because I'm picking the books that I'm gonna read and I know which books I'm hoping will end up favorites. But the good news is, at least on this one, I was correct. Now, I have come on here years now, more years than it feels like, and I feel like I'm always kind of lamenting that the last reading year, lamenting is a strong word, but I use hyperbole a lot, so we'll go with it, that the last reading year has been the worst for me in whatever way. And I know that there is so much discourse about how many books someone reads in a year and what is acceptable by anyone's given metric, and it's never going to be something where we're all on the same page. But as I've said before, as a person who loves books and has so many books that I am intrigued by and want to get to, as is evident by my anticipated releases videos, I like to read a lot and historically have read a lot. I also savor what I read. I don't have to justify myself. It's just how I operate. Now, last year we had a little bit of an uptick in the sense that I'd done better in 2024 in terms of numbers only. And also I read some long books. Like Our Share of Night was last year, my top book from last year, and that is a chunker. So I did slightly better in 2024 by like one book than 2023 technically, but I have been trending downwards since around 2020. Now, we have to take in, or I have to take in, contributing factors to that and be honest with myself about that as well. For instance, YouTube takes time, and that's going to take time that I could have been reading, and doom scrolling takes time, and I need to stop it. Hanging out with my friends also takes time, but I don't need to stop that. And so this year, unfortunately, again, I had my worst reading year since 2011, which is when Goodreads started the reading challenges. And so in 2024, I ended up reading a grand total of 105 books, which is none too shabby, do not get me wrong, but I also had a very weird reading year, which I think is contributing to how I'm kind of conceptualizing all of this. And I think it's been kind of evident even here that I have gone through some slump-ish periods where I just have felt kind of disconnected from my reading in whatever way. I'm still reading things I'm enjoying. I'm still reading actively, but there is something, it's like when I talk about in certain books having that kind of foggy barrier, it's been kind of like that this reading year. And I'm not saying this to diminish the books that I'm going to list as favorites because I very much enjoyed these books. Do not get me wrong, but I don't know that this was a standout reading year for me, which is fine because I have been reading for a long time, and not every year is going to be the best, but it's just been very kind of odd for me and has left me feeling a little discombobulated. At first, I thought it was just the Bridgerton season kind of taking me out of it, as I was really focused on that project and almost kind of in a dramaturgical mindset where I was really honed in on that and reading deeply and specifically for that. And I know that sounds weird, but like reading books within the same trope for my Wallflowers Recommend video, which to be fair is one of my favorite tropes, so that was not a burden in any way, and also kind of analyzing through different lenses, though not nearly as many as I probably ideally would have liked to. And so there were a lot of considerations this year, and that's just where we are. So enough qualifying. A wise woman once told me in college not to preface, and this has been a very long preface. So what do you say we just jump right into the books? Actually, that's a lie. First, hi, my name is Melody, if you have not been here before, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. I would love for you to hang out more if you feel so inclined, but either way, thanks for being here now. If you want to preemptively like, I surely won't stop you, but we have free will here, so you can do what you want, because you're going to anyway, let's be real. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the books. Now, I am going to save my favorite of the year for last, but other than that, I think we're going to go more in chronological order, and I have broken some of my stricter guidelines for the last couple of years in the sense that, one, the rules are made up and the points don't matter anyway, but historically I have always done my best of lists for books that release in the year. So it would have been books that published in 2024, and I have removed that limitation for myself in 2024. Will we talk about least favorite books of the year? It may depend on how much wine I have and how tired I get of talking. But I do, of course, want to highlight my favorites first and foremost, starting with one of the books that made me take away the limitations that I just mentioned: A Fever in the Heartland, The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America, and The Woman Who Stops Them by Timothy Egan. This made a splash in 2023, and I missed it by a couple of months because I started the year of 2024 with this. Not the first book I read in the year, but one of the first. Though, to be fair, I kind of wish it had been the first, and I listened to this on audio. And for those of you who have read this book, you know that it takes place in Indiana and is following the influence of the KKK in Indiana around the time of the book and the rise and fall of them as a consolidated power and a political power in Indiana, and how Indiana was being kind of used as an incubator for nationally, and how the KKK was really influencing politics nationally at the end of the day. And it would be hard to read this book and not kind of consider the contemporary parallels, and I think that you are supposed to very specifically consider those parallels, much in the way as dramaturgically, when we are looking at a play that takes place historically or a piece that has been done and revived again and again, there is this question of why this play, why here, why now, which is not an immediate question that necessarily needs answered as specifically for either historical fiction or nonfiction that deals with historical times and places, because generally it's just an interest. But I do think that there is something to be said about the historical minded work that draws parallels to the contemporary zeitgeist in whatever way that is. And this does that while also kind of exploring the zeitgeist of true crime, because we are dealing with a case. We are in some ways reclaiming this story for the woman who helped take down this power, even as she ultimately fell victim to the machine. At the same time, there were still times in the book where I thought we could have pushed that even further. However, I will acknowledge that a lot of my reaction to this book, which was incredibly well written, was very personal, because this was written about a state that I grew up in and the time that the case it was following happened, and the pinnacle of the power of the KKK in Indiana by the kind of exploration here would have been my grandparents' generation. And I think breaking it down at that level is incredibly important, because as I've said before about this book, with no malice to the community I grew up in, which was a very small community, there is this tendency to kind of paint things with rose-colored glasses. This idea of who we tell ourselves we are. And growing up, this particular history was not really acknowledged outside of like whisper networks. And whisper networks sounds very organized, but more just word of mouth sporadically. And I think that there is an intentional ignorance in trying to push this history away, in the sense that it brings shame, or at the very least it should bring shame. But we have this perception of what our intentions are and what these places are that aren't always or usually the reality of it. And to deny that our current moment is not influenced by things just 2 generations ago, and the way that we are seeing that rekindled in the modern moment, would be disingenuous at best. And I've seen these tensions of who we tell ourselves we are and what our history is perceived as versus actually is play out in real time in my community, in smaller ways, but ways nonetheless that I think illustrate the larger picture. And I think that this book should be required reading for Hoosiers. I think it is incredibly important to recognize our history and recognize how this history is still seeping into the present in a very real way. Because if this was my grandparents' generation, these were the sentiments that were fomenting the moment at that time. And it's frankly irresponsible to pretend that those sentiments have just gone away when we've really just seen those sentiments transfigure. Now, I promise I didn't intend to get up on my soapbox here, and I'm not maligning the entire state of Indiana by any means, but I think it's important history that we don't really talk about enough on that kind of community level, as well as the way that this book made it incredibly personal. And it was just a really valuable, scary, important, and still very engaging read, and was one of the best books of the start of the year for me, as well as the entire year for me. Though I promise, hopefully, not to dwell quite as long on the other titles. Now, jumping forward a couple of months to actually my best reading month of the year, I peaked very early this year. You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrique, translated by Natasha Wimmer. This is the second book by Enrique I have read, the first being Sudden Death, and this one I understood a lot more, but they have both stayed with me in different ways because they are just so weird. And if you know me, I like weird. And this is following the fall of the Aztec Empire through the colonialization from Spain, but from such a darkly comedic point of view. It focuses on this idea of the empire through the title in a way that really acknowledges the faults of both, in the sense that we have these rulers and these conquerors that are viewing things on these epic scales that fail to consider the everyday person and who falls kind of victim to these regime changes, as well, again, as we are talking about this idea of the historical moment that is rooted in the historical moment, but also feels reflective of something in the modern moment, this sense of excess that is explored, and the kind of idea of being disconnected from reality and the falls of empires that kind of result, all while having this kind of edge or bend of surrealism as well, which may not be completely accurate, but at least gives you a kind of sense of the tone. Now, I say I understood it much more because Sudden Death was also very odd, but odd in the way where it was a lot more conceptual, and you had to kind of take a lot more on faith as a reader, or maybe I just didn't fully understand it. I mean, I know I didn't fully understand it, but maybe I didn't even understand as much as I thought I understood. That being said, I liked stretching myself in that way. Here, I was still stretching myself, but it had a little bit more focused narrative shape in terms of the structure and the plotting of things. But again, it really was kind of this character study and us as a reader kind of viewing the flaws of these people who set the destiny of the rise and fall of empires. And additionally now, months later, apologies, I am drawing more parallels to the classic Calderon de la Barca play, Life is a Dream, which I would need to revisit because I have not read it since I was in college, but I think there are probably parallels there as well in terms of how we are kind of conceptualizing this and the kind of allegory for the human experience in whatever way. Absurdist. I think I'm looking for absurdist more than surrealist, but also now that I'm thinking of Life is a Dream, which took place or was written during the Spanish Golden Age, maybe I need to circle back and do some more analysis between those two there, because they may be more in conversation than I first thought. But even without that added extra layer, this still makes it on to one of my best books of the year for just how, again, weird it is. And I appreciate the narrative risks it takes, which may land to differing degrees for different readers. Obviously. March really was probably my best reading year. That was not hyperbole on my March wrap-up video, because it has 3 of my favorites of the year, including my number one of the year, which we obviously won't be talking about next, but next we will be talking about The Foxwife by Yang Zichu, which I loved. And I feel like this rose for me over the course of the year because I recognized how much I enjoyed it. And it's that kind of blend of the supernatural with historical fiction that really is a bread and butter kind of subgenre for me that I have not been reading in as actively lately. And I absolutely loved this story, which mixed these dual perspectives and dual narratives that kind of came together between a man solving the mystery of a woman who died in the alley by a restaurant and a fox spirit seeking revenge on the man responsible for the death of her son, and how these two narratives, like I said, come together, but also how our fox spirit encounters some people from her past along this journey. And with that, I loved the supernatural elements. And I mentioned this in my review of The Foxwife as well, but it has some of those explorations, or seeing a supernatural entity kind of move throughout time is one of the things that really draws me to vampire fiction. Obviously, there are other elements there as well and other subtext, but for me, I have historically not responded as well to vampires who are younger because I really enjoy that sense of time that comes with the vampire lore. And here with the fox spirits, I felt like we got to see that. We got the sense that they had moved throughout time and there was that weight of history and how they interacted with the world. But the way that time and age in particular was handled within the construct of this was so refreshing because we had a kind of grandmother character in this book who was treated so well by the narrative and so respected by the narrative and the people in her life. And she also had such a healthy kind of view on aging and her place in the world, and was happy about what aging represented for her, the power she was able to grow into as a woman with her age, and the opportunity it provided, and looked forward to the future and continuing to grow old, and didn't fear that in the same way that I think we so often are trained to fear aging. And I just really, really responded to that element of it as well amidst everything, in the sense that I think that element was the biggest kind of joyous surprise for me in the book because it was just really comforting at the end of the day. And honestly, I shouldn't have been surprised by how much I responded to this book. While I haven't read The Night Tiger, which I really should get on, I bought a discounted ebook version of it years ago. I have no excuses. I mean, I clearly have plenty of excuses, but I need to get on it. But The Ghost Bride, which I still haven't seen the movie of either because I need to reread the book anyway. The Ghost Bride was one of my favorite Barnes & Noble Discover Bay picks when it first came out. I mean, past when it first came out, but it remained one of the top books I ever picked up in the Discover New Writers Bay at Barnes & Noble as a member, and I picked up a lot of books from that bay because I liked discovering new voices, and I specifically liked discovering new voices with the stackable coupons, because back in the day, the Discover New Writers Bay was 20% off. Members got 10% off on top of that, and we would frequently get the 20% off coupons. So I would stack all of those together and get a new to me author and take a chance. Well, a new to everyone author if it was on that bay. Anyway, Chu is an author I have historically enjoyed, and The Foxwife was no different. Also, it did have some romantic subplot leanings that weren't the main focus of the story, but I would be lying if I said that they didn't enhance my enjoyment of the story. Now, speaking of romantic subplots, except for the subplot part and just the plot, my next favorite is also not a 2024 release, but it is one of the Diana Quincy's that I read this year. And if you have been with me for most of the year, you probably can anticipate which one, because it did win my Mass Market Madness bracket, which included some of my favorite historical romance authors. So it was a pretty stacked bracket, but The Duke Gets Desperate by Diana Quincy was ultimately the winner and is ultimately one of my favorite books of the year. It follows Strick, who is unsurprisingly based on the title, a duke, and Rhea, and has a lot of my favorite kind of components of historical romance. It has pining, it has tension, it has attraction that overcomes the tension, it has an outside antagonist and forced proximity, even if it's not a marriage of convenience, and I just really enjoyed this one. It follows Strick, whose stepmother, who he did not appreciate, has just passed away, and he has anticipated reclaiming the ancestral home. One of his biggest resentments against his stepmother is the fact that his father left her the home and it was supposed to be his. But instead of getting the home back, Strick's stepmother has willed it to her cousin, Rhea, who comes over to claim what she has just been told, I believe, is an inheritance. I don't think she originally knows it is the full home. Actually, she might just be coming over to spend some time with her cousin because she's had a blow up with her brother because they run the family business together. But after the death of her father, her brother has kind of pushed her out, and she was really the brains behind everything, really. And so this provides her a new project, an opportunity to kind of prove herself and her mettle, and she really does want the best for the property and the people that live on the property. And so there's always this mutual respect between the two, which I really respond to, because even though there's this clashing of wills between them and Strick really resents her and kind of actively hates her at first because of what she represents, he always respects her. And so that makes that tension all the more delicious, I think, for me personally, especially because it is, on an even playing field in that way. And then, of course, when that tension kind of bubbles over, it's even more delicious in those moments where they can't resist themselves. They may be locked in a place together at some point in a very satisfying moment. And so I really, really enjoyed this one. It is listed as the first in a series, but there are no follow-ups listed that I can find, and I will be devastated if we don't get anything more in this world. I mean, I'm sure I will be fine, but kind of in wake of our conversations around historical romance right now, I really want more. And so yeah, it's really delicious. It does take place pretty predominantly on the country estate, which was one of the only drawbacks. I do tend to like them kind of mingling in larger society at some point, in the sense that I kind of like that moment of realization for especially the hero as his kind of whole life is thrown asunder. But I think Strick's life is suitably asunder. And again, I like that kind of moment at the end where we have this kind of outside antagonist, similar to if you like Lisa Kleypas or Julie Garwood or A Caribbean Paris and Heiress has a great outside antagonist moment at the end of the first book. So things of that nature. But I highly encourage you to pick this one up if you haven't yet and like historical romance, because it is one of my top of the year. Next in my top of 2024 is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, which I had a real moment of kind of reading synchronicity with this book this year, in that I was reading it when Taylor Swift's The Tortured Poets Department came out, which led me to doing a whole kind of analysis of the album. The album led me, not this book led me, to do an entire analysis of the album through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics as a tragedy. And Glorious Exploits is obviously, well, not obviously, Glorious Exploits is the perfect kind of comedic foil that is dealing with the production of a tragedy, specifically Medea, but it takes place during the Peloponnesian War and follows two unemployed Athenian potters as they essentially force a bunch of prisoners of war to entertain them. And they are not the brightest of bulbs. They are very much the kind of comedic everyman if we are considering this through a kind of poetics lens where tragedy is reserved for those of great import. And there are kind of circumstances of great import that kind of coincide with the action of the book, but it's interesting how it's always kind of viewed at a glance through the lens of these two fools, essentially. It's like if Waiting for Godot things actually happened, which I know defeats the purpose of Waiting for Godot, but also I don't have to like it, even if I understand it. But I like this. This was funny and dark and weird. It was like a more intellectual Christopher Moore without like totally lambasting Christopher Moore, because Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff was like revolutionary for me as a teenager. But this was such an interesting, innovative, darkly funny book that again was set historically with this comedic bend in a way that was a very apt commentary for today. And I don't know, and granted again, I haven't been everywhere this year, but I don't know that this has been getting the buzz that I anticipated it getting. And so at the very least, it's made it onto my favorites of the year, and take that as you will, I guess. Then next was Woodworm by Leila Martinez, translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott. There is a theme, as honestly always, a very odd fiction, whether it be comedically odd or just kind of horrifically odd fiction in my favorites. That is what it is. This falls more on the kind of horrifically odd, but not in a jump scare kind of horrific way. It's also part of the very successful run of Mariana Enriquez blurbed books for me this year, though I have not yet gotten to Pink Slime, the other being Thirst by Morena Sasuzak, which is an honorary mention in this moment. But Woodworm was just so compelling, and I think the pacing worked so well. You can see that I really responded, or maybe you can't see based on the focus there. I really responded to the language in this book. There are so many passages I marked in a very slim volume, which honestly is not the norm for me. And on its face, it really is the kind of quintessential intergenerational trauma explored through a haunted house, and the way that the home can represent a manifestation of the sins of the family or what have you. But I think the way that it was executed was just so wonderful. There was this sinister nature to everything, while at the same time, as a reader, there were these conflicting point of views. And I mean, just from the blurb, the house breathes, the house holds bodies and secrets. The house is visited by ghosts, by angels that line the roof like insects, and by saints that burn the bed sheets with their halos. And so this book really excels in its visualization of these ideas and the atmosphere it creates, as well as the characters, because the conceit of the novel is the daughter of the house coming back after having been away, and we find out having been in jail and why she was in jail, and whether she was incorrectly incarcerated based on working for this very influential family in town, and her and this house being on the outskirts of town, and there being a lot of judgment and this kind of small town mindset around things, but also the house holds a lot more secrets than are first evident. And so we watch this unwinding of these narratives and who we as readers can trust, while this language really enmeshes us in this atmosphere. And the language is just really gorgeous, while also being incredibly succinct, especially for the length of this book. So, unsurprisingly, because it is on this list, a favorite. What may be more surprising, because I am not generally a reader of sports romances, however, The Prospects by Katie Hoffman was a favorite for this year. And this follows Jean, who is the first out trans player in minor league baseball, as a former college teammate and rival of sorts is traded to his team, and not just traded to his team, but ends up taking the position that Jean had been working really hard for. And the tension there, especially as they end up being roomed together for away games in an effort to hopefully make them play better on the field, because the tension is carrying over into their playing, and how they get to know each other better and grow closer because of this, and kind of overcoming the obstacles of communication, as Jean is very outgoing and friendly and Luis is a little bit more reserved. And there are reasons for that, but we have to uncover them together. Now, I wrote in my original review for this, my original very short review for this, I adored this. I may not know much about baseball, but I know a lot about characters that refuse to let themselves want for fear of being disappointed, and these two captured my heart. There's a missed opportunity for a baseball metaphor there. And I will not be searching for redemption in that opportunity now, but there is a lot of desire and want in this in differing forms. I mean, obviously we have the romance side of it, but these are characters, particularly with Jean, who Jean is making the most. He loves nothing more than playing baseball, and he has kind of resigned himself to life in the minor leagues, which is part of the tension with Luis being traded, because Luis has a future in Major League Baseball that is very much kind of understood by everyone in the book. And so we watch watch as Gene has to kind of allow himself to want, and his really friendly front, which isn't disingenuous, but it is being kind of used to hide this deep well of desire in him and what exactly it looks like to give voice to those desires and what that means. And there's just something very endearing about both of the love interests in this book. Additionally, in something that feels like the opposite of what I would normally respond to or would normally be my preference, the baseball isn't just set dressing here. There really is an understanding of the game from Hoffman, which thankfully within the writing is explained well enough that I don't have to understand all of the nuances of like the different games and how things progress within kind of series or what have you in minor league baseball, but the stakes of the game itself and the joy of the game itself is always really evident. And we see the realities of playing long term on some of these teams for these characters. And I don't mean that in like a psychological way necessarily, but just like the wear and tear on your body and what it means to be an athlete in the long term like that as well. And so there is just a lot to love about this book. I listened to this on audio. It was absolutely a delight. It was one of my biggest surprises of the year, I think. I expected to enjoy it, but I don't know that I expected to fall in love with these characters as much as I did. Next, surprising no one, A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez. This is her latest collection of short stories, and we are incredibly lucky to be getting them so close to our share of night, so I am bracing myself for a large drought coming, but there is something still so odd and intriguing about these stories, while they also feel kind of different than the previous two collections in some ways. The previous two collections being Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which I kind of conceptualize personally as a reader as kind of inverses of each other. Here, I feel like it's much more evident that a lot of these stories are coming after 2020. The kind of considerations, if not the characters themselves, feel a little bit more aged up from previous collections, especially from The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, where a lot of the drive of that felt kind of youthful and the kind of exploration of youthful indiscretions. Again, nothing is across the board in any of these. There are always stories that are the exception to the rule, but just kind of trying to view the collection as a whole. And on one hand, I just enjoyed it, right? So I kind of just went along for the ride, but still kind of recognizing or trying to recognize the overarching themes of the collection itself. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really an exploration of loneliness and community, which I think makes sense in light of world events the last half a decade, as well as if we're talking about kind of the aging up of some of the explorations in this. A lot of this kind of plays with what it means to get older as a woman. And so I think there's a lot to be said too about the exploration of these themes in combination with these characters that are frequently women, middle age, approaching middle age, or later, and what exactly those two are in conversation. Again, never across the board, but also most importantly, it still has that lurking danger. I will say the ghosts, so to speak, sometimes manifest a little differently in here outside of, I want to say, the first story and maybe the last couple of stories. There is a little bit more of a silent kind of disquiet that permeates, but now I feel like I am drawing generalizations that I may end up regretting in retrospect. So just know it's Mariana Enriquez, it's creepy, it's delightful, and at the end of the day, it's exactly what I wanted. Next, we have my vindication for waiting until after the end of the year to settle on my favorites for the year, because we have Amari and the Despicable Wonders by B.B. Alston, which I just reviewed in a Feature Friday, but this is the third in the Amari Supernatural Investigation series, and originally I believe it was supposed to be the finale of the series, and we are now supposedly getting 5 books in the series, and we definitely end on another cliffhanger while also kind of wrapping up the original arc of the book. Now, I did have some critiques of some of the pacing and the way that characters developed in this book in comparison of that arc and consideration of that arc, but at the end of the day, I really enjoy these books. And these books fill me with so much joy. And as I have said again and again, and I will continue to say, they have helped me rediscover a wonder that is one of the great joys of this particular kind of middle grade fantasy that I was afraid was kind of lost to me. And that wonder really continues throughout this book as we get to push wider in to the supernatural world, and we get to discover new things by spending a lot of time in a haunted house with one of the real housewives of the undead and her son Peekaboo, who becomes a ghost for our crew, as well as we are still on a quest, so we are still going to different parts of the supernatural realm. We are still revisiting places that we know, but we are outside of that kind of school setting, which was a risk in some ways because that kind of summer camp school setting is really fun and it is familiar, and pushing the bounds of the world is hard. And so it was a lot of fun. I continue to just really love Amari and her heart, as well as the hearts of her friends. And there were a lot of big explorations here as Amari goes up essentially against Dylan in the kind of arc that we've had going on over the course of the series, as well as having Quentin back and Amari having to answer to someone else in some ways, but also kind of reconsidering her brother or seeing her brother in a new light in wake of her own moral compass and what she knows and thinks is right, as well as her existence as a magician, and Quentin having to kind of reconcile that and if he succeeds. But amidst this really heavy kind of weight of the stakes of the kind of finale of this, even if it is a series that's continuing, we've got this kind of main arc that is being wrapped up here, and there is a lot of weight to that. We still manage to pull back, partly by kind of widening the world a little bit and getting to kind of watch Amari and the crew off to the side of the big events. The big events are still happening, they're pushing towards the climax, but by removing them from the center of it, we don't feel as much of that pressure, which I think is important narratively, even if I think we could have added a little bit of pressure back in, which I don't love saying because I was having such a great time, but from my more analytical brain. But this is my enjoyment brain, and my enjoyment brain says this is one of my favorite books of the year because I just love this world and I love these characters and it brings me a lot of joy. And I am incredibly grateful to have something that brings me a lot of joy. Also, I want to say that I think it is important to recognize, because I think it's so easy not to, or that it's easy to overlook and view as kind of simple, because it has this kind of quirkier, more wondrous, more endearing style to it, that is still incredibly hard. Something like Amari, where there is this joy and wonder suffused throughout these bigger explorations and these big themes, and helping especially middle grade readers kind of figure out the world and how they fit within it. All of that, like, that is not nothing by any means. It's far more than nothing, in fact. And I just want to give the credit to that craftsmanship that it deserves when I recognize that a good deal of the books that end up on this list are a little darker, a little more experimental, which does kind of segue us unintentionally, pretty perfectly, into my favorite book of the year, which I think that you could probably guess, and that is The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden, which was a delightful surprise. And delightful feels wrong for that book in some ways, but it was just stunning. Arden, of course, wrote the Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, which also was a historical fantasy series that really sets itself on the precipice of change and these moments, these historical moments of great change. And I love that series quite a lot. And I knew that this book, that takes place in the middle of World War I and is following a Canadian nurse who has already been on the front lines, and her brother who goes missing on the front, and her quest to find him was obviously going to be set on the precipice of great change again, but in a much different way. And I don't always, as I have said before, gravitate first toward World War narratives. And World War I narratives in particular are hard because there is a senselessness to it. And I think World War narratives, or the idea of conflict at that scale right now, is also just a lot to want to think about. However, again, we have this kind of theme of a lot of these books that I've responded to the most this year in terms of like their historical explorations. While they are all kind of beyond just historical fiction at face value, there's something odd generally going on with them in some way, because I love an odd supernatural touch. But there is this sense, well, I guess one's nonfiction, so it doesn't count. But all of these books root themselves in the world of their books so specifically, within the historical worlds of these stories so specifically, but at the same time, it is so easy to transpose a lot of that into the modern moment, or take modern meaning out of those historical explorations. And I think that that is what kind of helps elevate them in a lot of ways too, because they are so clearly and intentionally their own thing, but they have greater resonance. And I think the supernatural elements here, the kind of wondrous, devilish elements here, really help elevate it. And I expected nothing less from Arden, because we had those elements in The Bear and the Nightingale, but seeing the horrors of war explored in this liminal space, the liminal space of the front. And while I love a liminal space, I recognize that this is probably the most horrific iteration of a liminal space. But the way that this was such an intense character study, I cared for these characters so much, and the kind of impossible positions these characters were put in, their search for love and companionship and each other, they're reaching out for each other amidst the chaos and the bloodshed. The way that getting lost to the horrors of war were explained here and explored and visualized, embodied here, while also exploring characters who never gave up on the ones they loved. There is just so much in this book. It was so moving. It was so emotionally impactful. I think that the supernatural elements of it worked so well, especially in kind of consideration of the kind of schools of art that came out of World War I, when we think of kind of the surrealism that comes out and the way that those elements kind of exist within the book. Not directly connected, but this book also made me think of Dada for the first time in probably years, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I utterly adored this book, and it earns a well-deserved place as my top book of 2024. A couple additional honorary mentions for 2024 include A Crane Among Wolves by June Her. I love her historical YA fiction, and I love the romantic elements that have been woven into her last two releases. And I just know her 2026 adult debut, which I believe is going to be historical romance, is just going to absolutely change me as a person. Additionally, The City in Glass by Nevo, which is the exploration of the life cycle, essentially, of a city, and in some ways the love affair between the demon that guards a city and the angel that smites it, but also so much more. So the good news is, despite that kind of feeling of disconnect that I referenced at the beginning, there are so many good reads when I kind of break it down for the year, which is so exciting. Now, that being said, there were still some misses, and I won't dwell on them too long, but they were kind of a bummer. The first being Sure, I'll Join Your Cult, a memoir of mental illness and the quest to belong anywhere by Maria Bamford. I really enjoy explorations of cults, and I was very excited about this book. As I envisioned it, a kind of humorous, self-reflective look at being a person susceptible to cults, especially taken in consideration with what we know from the book Cultish, and how people are not too smart to get sucked into a cult, right? But also what types of characters get sucked into cults, especially kind of on a serial basis. And this was none of that. Most of the cults being explored here were more like 12-step programs. There was no real self-reflection. The humor was not funny. There were a lot of hits or kind of snarky comments against her family. Maybe if I was more familiar with her work before, I would have responded better to it, or maybe I would have had a more realistic expectation of what I was going to get going in. There was also like a whole portion or whole portions about how hard it is to write a book, and just struggling to write the book, but she'd have to give her advance back, and how she pitched the book on concept, and I don't want to hear any of that. It was hard enough, honestly, hearing that in Amy Poehler's book, and it was kind of endearing then, and now it's just like, okay, so you didn't actually want to write this book. I'm not getting getting anything out of this book I went in expecting, and so it felt like a cash grab without any insights or any chuckles, and I resent it. Additionally, another audiobook, Immortal Born by Lindsay Sands, which I downloaded because it seemed like that perfect mid-2000s paranormal romance, but as I wrote in my review after finishing it, flat characters, exposition heavy, tell versus show in terms of action, a romance that relied on fated mates completely rather than using it as a tool, gay villains in a world that, at least in this book, and would not argue this stands alone as this is my first foray into this world, has no other queerness. I would have thought this book came out in 2002, not the last decade. I think that actually may have been my most disliked book of the year, and I finished it mainly because I had spent a Libro.fm credit. No, I didn't spend a credit. I paid actual money because I bought it on sale, but still, I paid for it. Additionally, The Reluctant Countess by Eloisa James was a bummer and disappointing because I have generally liked Eloisa James, though she can be hit or miss for me, is what I'm realizing. I wrote here, and to think I actually thought Lydia, who is the sister in this book, would be a fun side character after the first book. Alas, she's almost a cartoonish villain, and not in the fun way here, and it overshadows the main couple, especially when Giles isn't standing up for his love interest in any way that matters. This should have been delicious tension based on the setup, but it didn't feel like it paid off. And at the end of the day, the fact that the love interest, Giles here, did not feel like he respected his heroine in any way. I was not rooting for this couple in any way. In fact, I was actually rooting for the heroine to escape him at many points, and I also resented that a character I thought was going to be really fun in the setup in How to Be a Wallflower turned out being this really over-the-top cartoonish villain. Again, not in the fun way. And then finally, my last big disappointment of the year, unfortunately, because I was really looking forward to this book, was Song of the Six Realms by Judy I. Lin. This was set up as a YA fantasy romance. It seemed like it was going to be in the vein of Daughter of the Moon Goddess with this kind of celestial love interest, and maybe this was just a sign that I actually need to finally read the sequel to Daughter of the Moon Goddess, which was one of my favorite books the year it came out, because this felt really flat to me, or fell very flat to me. The characters were flat, and honestly, the characterizations felt incredibly juvenile to me, and there wasn't much going on in terms of the characterizations or the plotting, and that was a huge bummer. And I hate saying that because the cover is gorgeous and the conceit is great. The execution, unfortunately, just didn't work for me, so it was more just one of my bigger disappointments. It didn't like fill me with rage like Immortal Born kind of did, but unfortunately, it just didn't work out the way I had hoped. But I had, as we have discussed previously, a great many that did. So those were my best and a couple worst of 2024, and I am interested to hear what you think. If any of these books made it onto your lists, or if you just enjoyed them throughout the year, regardless of whether they made it to a final list or not, what your best of the year are, whatever, however you want to conceptualize it. But thank you for being here and being interested in what my favorites of the year were and still hanging in this moment. If you are still here, go ahead and like and subscribe if you have not done that, because it is much appreciated. But cheers to 2024 in the rearview mirror, and another year of reading coming up with 2025 with a lot of really anticipated releases. And we'll get back into it with talking about those anticipated releases, reviewing books, and chatting bookish things as they pop up throughout the year. So we will see what 2025 holds. But thank you again for not only being interested in my thoughts on the 2024 reads or my favorite 2024 reads, but having been here with me for however long in 2024, whether it's just this video or whether you have been around for the whole year. I very much appreciate it. So thank you again. Read something good. We have a brand new year of reading to kick off, so let's kick it off with something good. And yeah, bye.